Hi everyone, it's Ruth. Today we're going to take a look at paper bead making. It's a really fun process that doesn't need a whole lot of supplies. Basically paper, scissors, and a glue stick, right? So it's a pretty accessible project to do. Um, we'll start our project today kind of talking about some of the supplies, and then we'll go through that process, start to finish, how to create these paper beads, and how we'll talk a little bit about how to seal them as well. So before we start, let's just talk a little bit about some of my examples here. I have a couple of ways to use these paper beads. So even if you're not a fan of jewelry, there are other ways to use paper beads. So my examples here, I have a necklace that someone else made. I didn't make this one, but it's one of my favorite pieces of jewelry. I love wearing this piece. But I show it so you can see there are a couple different types of paper beads that you can make. You can make some small rounded ones, even some larger ones, or some flat beads too. So you can really make a variety of beads. Now this necklace has some actual plastic beads that were added in too to add a little oomph. But paper beads they have some really great character that you can add in. And I will say every time I wear this necklace, I get compliments on it. It's unusual and such an interesting piece, and it's made from magazines. So how can you not want to like give compliments, right? I also have a pair of earrings, and these I actually made, and you can see they're small like paper beads that I just added to a tarnished set of silver hoops, right? So give it extra character and kind of zhuzh it up a little bit, right? And I also have some paper beads that I made that I used for some book binding. So I have a book that I eco printed and built, created, and I added some paper beads as embellishment for that. So you can see there are a variety of ways to use paper beads, and there are a variety of looks that these paper beads can have. So I just wanted to kind of show that a little bit to show the variety, illustrate the variety in beads. So I'm going to go ahead and get these out of the way, and let's talk supplies. So as I said earlier, we don't need a whole lot of supplies for this project. Basically, paper, scissors, and glue. There are a couple other things that are really helpful, and we'll talk about all those supplies. But the basic supplies that we need are things you have around the house. Before we start, let's talk a little bit about the illustrated instructions. Just like all our illustrated instructions, they have the list of supplies at the top, and then step by step, that process is laid out. Now, I'll be guiding us through that process today, but these illustrated instructions are helpful if you want to do this project again, if you enjoy it, and you want to repeat it. So we'll follow along with those illustrated instructions today, but know that I'll be guiding us through it. So no worries. Also in that packet, the illustrated instruction packet, you'll see there's a page on sealing your paper beads. I'll do a demo on how to do that, but there are a couple options for sealants to help protect our beads, and we'll go over that in a bit. But we're going to start off with our paper beads. So if you have the illustrated instructions handy, go ahead and pull that out. The next thing we need is going to be our paper bead template. So in a packet, you'll see it just has a big zigzag right across the top. Nothing fancy, but just that big zigzag. And we're going to use that as our template today. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But what we're using are elongated triangles. You can use some different shapes. You can use wider triangles or narrower triangles. You can use a straight strip, and that works as well. You'll get different shape beads from that. But we're going to use this template today to kind of get us started. The next thing we need is going to be some paper. So I've got some pieces of colored paper, tie-dye looking paper, and I'm going to be using that for today. But you can use copy paper, you can use construction paper, you can use scrapbooking paper, magazine pages, wrapping paper, junk mail, newspapers. Basically, any paper is going to work well. The only thing that you want to kind of pay attention to when it comes to the type of paper you're wanting to use is you want to make sure that it's not super thin like tissue paper. And that's only because it's a little harder to work with. So having something that's kind of the thickness of like copy paper, printing paper, is a good thickness to work with. I'll talk a little bit about how to do like scrapbooking paper or cardstock. It's a little thicker, so you have to treat it just slightly different. But you can still make beads that way. You can make bigger beads with the scrapbooking paper, that thicker paper. It's slightly different, but still doable. So go ahead and pull some some paper out that you'd like to use today. Like I said, I'm going to be using some printed paper, copy paper today that's got some tie-dye colors on it. The next thing we need is going to be those skewers. So if you have your kit, go ahead and pull those skewers out. And they're just regular meat skewers like you use for cooking. It has that sharp point on the end so we can stab it down in a piece of styrofoam or cardboard to hold it steady. You can use other things besides this. You can use like the end of an ice pick or chopstick. You can use toothpicks, you can use a paintbrush or a pen, anything that's kind of narrow and thin, so we can build our beads around them. The skewers are ideal, like I said, because they have that point at the end that you can stab into like a box to kind of hold it steady when we do our gluing, but it's not absolutely necessary to have that point. So anything that's long and slender will work well for that base. Now, those are the basic things we need out of our printmaking or paper bead project, right? The only other thing would be a glue stick. So if you have your glue stick handy, go ahead and pull that out. I've got mine here. The glue stick is how we're going to fix that bead to itself. We don't really need it to secure it. We just need it to hold it in place until we can get that sealant on. And again, we'll talk about sealant in just a little bit, but that glue stick is going to be our friend today. So go ahead and pull that glue stick out. And now there's a couple of supplies that we need that are not in the kit. One of them is a pair of scissors. We're going to do some cutting today, so we need those scissors handy. And then the other thing is a piece of styrofoam, a cardboard box, or even a cup, just something to kind of hold the skewers while the glue dries. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But let's go ahead and start with our process today. If we look at those illustrated instructions, let me get this stuff out of the way. We look at our illustrated instructions. That very first step is to cut that template up, cut those strips out. And so we're going to pull out our template, cut it up so we have these triangles that we can use on our paper. So I'm going to set this just aside for a little bit. And take the paper. This is the paper that I'm going to be using today. And so I'm just going to take my template, and you can see it has that zigzag shape. What I'm going to do is cut it out, right? But I'm going to cut it out in kind of a weird way. I'm not cutting out those individual triangles. So how I cut it out, I'm cutting triangles out of one side, but I'm leaving it connected at the top. So I'm just cutting those triangles out of that one side, right? And the reason we do that is because it's a little easier to handle when it comes to drawing those triangles on the paper, right? So if we have this one strip, we can easily line it up to the top of that paper and draw from there. So I've got my template cut out. So go ahead, you can pause the video if you like, take a moment to cut your template out. Paper bead making is not a super fast process. There's a little setup that goes along with it, but it can be a really almost soothing process because it's that repetitive motion of wrapping that we'll get into in just a moment. So go ahead, pause the video, take a moment, cut those pages out, gather your paper, cut your template, and we'll talk in just a moment about how to cut it out. All right, so we have our template cut out, and I'm going ahead and lining it up on my paper here. I'm going to use that tie-dye paper to cut, or as my bead itself, bead paper. And so I'm going to take, I'm going to use a marker because it's a little easier to see on camera, but you can use just a pencil. You don't need anything fancy for it. And we're just going to kind of trace that template, right? And so I'm just going to take my marker and just kind of follow it down. And you want to be careful with tracing it because it's thin paper. That template will move a little bit, but I want to say this. It is okay if your lines are a little wonky. I know my hand isn't very steady, and so my lines get a little shaky. But the truth is, if your lines are a little wonky, that's okay, because we can straighten it out when we do that cutting part. And so I'm just drawing a few of my triangles here. You can go all the way across if you like, but once I pick my template up, you can see I've got those triangles drawn. So our next step, after we cut our template out, we draw out our triangles, is to cut those triangles out. And this is what we're going to use for those beads. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that first part. I'm going to cut off and discard. And that's because it's not the right shape of triangle. It's more of a right triangle, and we need one that kind of the point is in the center. And so discard that first piece. And we're going to use that second piece is when we're going to start our folding. So you can see it's kind of obvious my shaky hand. Again, know that that's okay. It's okay if it's shaky, because when you do your cutting, you can make it straight, right? And so I'm just cutting those strips out. And so if you've got your template already drawn, go ahead and cut those triangles out. One of the things I want to mention too, as we're doing the cutting, is that it doesn't have to be a point at the end. You can see my triangles have little points, but if it's flat instead of pointed, that's okay too. You'll see this piece I'm cutting right now has that flat edge or the flat end. And that's okay. It's not as important. That end part is not as important as that length, right? Whether it has a point at the end or a flat edge, that doesn't matter when it comes to the actual bead making process. So I'm just going to finish cutting out my last couple pieces that I drew out here. And then we'll move on to our next step. Again, take your time with this process. If you are not ready to move on to the next step, you're still cutting pieces out, just go ahead and pause the video and take your time with it. What we're going to do right now is that next step, step 2. So if we look at our illustrated instructions, that next step is to start adding that glue and winding those beads up, right? And so it may feel a little complicated, but take a breath. It can be a fun process. Now I'm right hand dominant, so I'm going to use my right hand to do the wrapping, and I'm going to use my left hand to kind of hold that skewer steady, hold that bead steady. This is a way that is easy for me and makes sense to me, but we'll talk about other ways that may feel comfortable when it comes to that wrapping part. Now there's a little trick to the wrapping that I just want to go over. Now the paper I'm using is printed on both sides, so it doesn't matter how I'm holding my paper. But if you are using something like a magazine page and you want a certain color to be shown, whatever you want, like whatever color you want it to be, whatever pattern you want your bead to be, you want to make sure that that pattern is face down, right? Because when we wind it up on itself, that outside is what's going to be shown, right? And so I am the part where I have my wonky lines. I'm making sure that's facing me, so it gets wound up and I don't see it in the end when I wind my bead up. So to start our wrapping, I'm just going to take the bottom of that triangle, that wide edge of the triangle, and I'm going to start wrapping it around that skewer. Now, it may be hard to start with. This is probably the trickiest part when it comes to paper bead making. But what we're going to do, one thing that I found that helps me is to take that flat edge and just kind of roll it for a minute on that skewer, right? And what that does is I don't know if you can see it clearly, it kind of bends that edge a little bit, so it helps with that wrapping. So if you do that, kind of that first step of just kind of bending that edge, it makes it a little easier when it comes to wrapping. So once you've got that edge bent just a little bit, we're going to take our time and just roll it up. And like I said, this is kind of the tricky part when it comes to bead making, paper bead making, but just take your time with it, and it's okay to readjust, right? There's no need to rush through this one. So I've got my rolled up edge, and I'm going to start rolling it up. I'm not adding glue just yet. And the reason I am not adding glue is because I don't want to glue my bead to my skewer, right? So I'm letting it wrap around that skewer like once or twice, and then I'm going to add that glue. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my glue stick now and just add a little bit of glue. It doesn't have to be a lot. You can see it doesn't go to the edge. The purpose of this glue is to really hold it in place until we get that sealant on there. And so I've got a little bit of glue and I'm just going to wrap it up. You can see I'm using my right hand, my dominant hand, to do that wrapping. And I'm using my left hand, my pointer finger, to kind of hold it in place. This is a way that I found helpful to make the paper beads, but whatever way feels comfortable to you, do that. It's not really about how you're wrapping them, the process you're using specifically. It's all about kind of wrapping it up, that it gets wrapped up and glued. I know someone shared earlier, one of the ways that they found to wrap it up was to kind of hold it on the counter and roll it that way. And that may feel a little more comfortable to people, and definitely do that if it does. And so I'm just going to add a little bit of glue to the end. And I'm going to make sure I'm adding enough glue to that point, because once I start wrapping that up, rolling that up, that little point I need to hold in place, right? So I've got glue on that point and I'm just holding it down, pinching it for just a moment so it's in place. And you can see I have that paper bead, right? This is the basic process for paper bead making, cutting it out, rolling it up, and gluing it down, right? But you can see, because I didn't add the glue to that first little bit of paper on my triangle, you can see my paper bead, it moves, right? And so I'm just going to kind of take it off and set it aside. And we'll walk through this process again. So let me go ahead and pull a new piece out. And it's just a reminder, whatever you want to be on the outside of the bead, you want to make sure that that's facing down when you start your rolling process. And so I've got my triangle, I've got the flat edge of my triangle, and I'm just going to start just kind of wrapping it up just a tiny bit, rolling it so it kind of curves that edge. Everyone see? Kind of curves that edge. And that makes it a little easier when it comes to that wrapping part. And just as a reminder, we don't add that glue to the very beginning. We leave about a 1/4 inch maybe that's unglued. And it's so we don't glue that bead, that paper, to the skewer. And so I'm just going to roll it up just a little bit, a couple rounds. And then I'm going to start adding that glue, right? And again, it doesn't have to be super covered in glue. Sometimes it's better to do a little bit of glue, roll, a little bit of glue, roll, because the glue can dry pretty quickly. And you may find as you're rolling that you need to adjust a little bit. So take your time with that. Rolling, adjusting, making it straight, right? One of the things I want to mention too is just kind of problem solving, troubleshooting a little bit. Let's say you're rolling your bead up and maybe you had a tear, right? So I have a little tear in my paper here. I pulled a little too hard. The good news is you don't have to throw this away. You can keep using this piece. That tear doesn't make a difference, right? And that's because we're gluing it down. So if you have a little tear in your paper, know that that's okay. That's an easy fix. That's not a problem. Just take your glue and add that glue to it and then roll it up, right? Because you're gluing it to itself, gluing it in place. So you can't even see that tear, right? So little tears in it where you're ripping it, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having a little tear, and it's because we're using glue and we're gluing that paper to itself. So you can't break it, tear it too much, right? So I'm just gluing it down and making sure I'm gluing that, adding plenty of glue to that end, whether you have a point or a flat edge is okay, but you're just making sure you have plenty of glue there. So when you pinch it and hold it, it's able to kind of stick to itself, right? Okay, so you can see I've got another paper bead here. Now let's talk for a moment about different types of paper. I was using copy paper today. You'll kind of use that same process when you're using wrapping paper or newsprint, magazine pages, construction paper, that's all basically the same when it comes to working with making these beads. But let's say you have a piece of cardstock or scrapbooking paper that you want to use. I have some striped scrapbooking paper here, and so I'm just going to cut a strip. I'm going to cut it kind of straight across, all the way down. So using scrapbooking paper or cardstock is nice if you want a bigger bead. So let me pull my example out again, my necklace. What we've been making have been smaller beads, right? That's what we've been kind of going through, these small beads. But you can see there's some larger beads here. If you're using scrapbooking paper, you get a bigger bead quicker. If you're using regular paper and you want that a bigger bead, you'll just layer. And I'll show that. I'll do a little demo of that now. So I'm going to take scrapbooking paper. I've cut two pieces, cut it into strip. And with one of those pieces, I'm just going to kind of angle into a triangle. Not a harsh triangle, just kind of a little triangle here, and just kind of trim it a little bit. Yeah. And again, this is something like if you're using thicker paper, so cardstock, scrapbooking paper, something like that, that'll give you a thicker bead quicker, so you don't have to layer up a whole bunch. I'm going to be using two pieces today to kind of make that thicker bead. And so we'll start just the same way by taking that paper, and you see I have pattern on one side. So the part that I want seen, that pattern part, I'm going to do face down. And this one, I have just a regular strip. It's not to a triangle or anything like that. This is going to be my first strip that I use. And so I'm going to start the same way, just taking that end and kind of rolling it, right? Rounding it up a little bit. So you can see it has that curved, it's easier to see, that curved edge. And that'll help me when it comes to that rolling part, right? And so just like that paper, the copy paper, that thinner paper, we're going to roll a little bit before we add the glue. Again, because we don't want to glue our bead to the skewer. And so I'm just going to kind of roll a couple rounds. Yeah. And then I'm going to add my glue. Because this is thicker paper, you do need a little extra glue to hold it in place. And so I'm just going to kind of rub a little bit of glue on there, the glue stick, and wrap it up. And you see, because I'm right-handed, I'm using my right hand to do that rolling, and then my left hand to hold it still while I'm rolling. And I'm just kind of adjusting as I'm going through. And you can already see that bead is thicker than the other beads that I was making, right? That scrapbooking paper grew in size very quickly. You can use different types of glue for this. I find glue stick is the best because it dries quickly. And so it's kind of easy to work with, but you can use, like if you want to use double stick tape, tacky glue, Elmer's glue, Gorilla Glue, all of those glues work well too. Like I said, I just like the glue stick because it dries fast, and so it's easier for me to work with. But again, I'm just kind of rolling up this bead, coming to the end. Now, because I was using a straight strip, not a triangle strip, you don't have any like rounded edges when it's winding up, right? So I'm just going to add a little bit of glue to my end and wrap it up and hold it for a moment. Now with the other paper, we held it for just a moment so that glue can stick. When we're using cardstock, because it's thicker, it needs a little extra pressure. So we're going to hang on to it for a little longer. And then we add our next paper to it. But I'll show you already. This is the bead that I just made. And you can see that size difference, right? So if you're wanting a thicker bead, using a stiffer paper will be really beneficial. Will help with that. So I'm going to take my next strip, and this is that triangle strip, that elongated triangle that I cut. I'm going to use this one to give me some rounded edges. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start wrapping it around the bead that I just made, but I'm going to glue it down. Now, when we started our first bead, this first layer, we didn't put glue on it because we didn't want to glue the bead to the skewer. But because we're adding paper to our already rolled paper, we can add that little bit of glue. And so that's what I'm going to do right now, is just add a little bit of glue to that end. Because it's a pattern, I'm doing that pattern facing down because I want that pattern shown. Okay. And so I'm just going to start rolling that up. And it may take a minute to kind of get it lined up, get it straight, but just take your time with it. And then start rolling it up, gluing a little bit, adding plenty of that glue, plenty of the glue, and then rolling it. Taking your time with it, slowly adding the glue, adjusting it where you need to. Just rolling it up. One of the things you may notice as you're starting your project, especially if this is your first time making paper beads, if you're cutting out the triangles, you may notice that your bead is turning out asymmetrically. And that's okay. What that means is that it wasn't a super straight triangle, and the point of the triangle isn't straight. It's kind of to the side a little bit. And that's okay. But if you want that straighter triangle, it helps to have that like a template that you're using. And so when I get to the end, I'm just adding extra glue to that tip and then wrapping it up and holding it in place. And you can already see that that bead is rounded, right? So I'm just holding that end down for just a little bit and letting it kind of hold in place. Put my lid on my glue here. And that's how we make paper beads. So when you're done making your paper beads, it's always good to seal them. One of the things that I recommend for a sealant is Mod Podge. That is, I always talk about that being the magical art supply because Mod Podge, it can be an adhesive, it can be a sealant, you can use it to transfer images, like it can do so many things. So Mod Podge is a good thing to have in your art toolkit. But if you don't have Mod Podge, that's okay. There are a couple other things that you can use as a sealant. If you look in the illustrated instructions, I have a few listed here. I have just the Mod Podge, right? But you can also use clear nail polish. It's really great as a sealant and can dry pretty quickly. So it's a good option too. Another option is to take something like a tacky glue or an Elmer's glue and mix it with water. So 2 parts glue to 1 part water. So let's say if you're doing a cup of water, you'll want 2 cups of the glue. And if you mix that together, that glue and water together, you'll get a nice sealant, right? And so let me just talk for a moment about how to do that sealing. We'll use this bead here. So when you're ready to do that sealing, you want to put your beads back on your skewer. So I'm going to line my beads up that we made. And you can add a bunch to them. But then we'll start putting that sealant on. And I'm going to use the Mod Podge today because I think that white is a little easier to see than the clear nail polish. If you haven't used Mod Podge before, it's kind of a creamy white color like glue, but it dries clear. And so it's kind of nice to use. So what we'll need is we're going to take, if you're using Mod Podge or the glue water mixture, you'll get a brush. If you're using nail polish, you can use the brush that's in the nail polish. But what we're going to do is take that Mod Podge or that glue mixture and kind of brush it on top of that bead. This is not going to make it like waterproof, but it will make it a little resistant, right? So sweat won't affect it, a little rain won't affect it. And you can see with my brush, I'm just kind of adding that glue. I'm being careful not to glue the wood, right? Because I don't want my bead glued to the wood. I want to be able to string it. And so just kind of adding that glue. Be careful with it. You may notice that you need a couple layers, so a layer or 2 of it. Let it paint one on, let it dry, and then paint on it again. And you just want to kind of do that with all your beads. And so I'm going to do that right now with my next bead. Just adding that Mod Podge. Again, being careful not to glue my bead to the wood, and knowing that that the creamy white glue will turn, it'll end up clear. But I'm just kind of like adding that to it. And then this is where that cardboard box, styrofoam, or like a little cup or something comes in handy, because you can stick it in, stick the pointy end down, and it leaves these beads free to dry without touching anything. And so you can do it with a piece of cardboard or anything like that. Yeah. And so that's how we make our paper beads. Once the beads dry from that sealant, you can pull it off that skewer and string it up and use it in a necklace or earrings or for book binding. You can make a bookmark with it. There are lots of things that you can do with these paper beads. Thanks so much for joining me today and doing the paper bead making with me. I really enjoy this process, so it's really nice to be able to share it with others. So happy crafting, everyone. Have fun with your bead making.